Well, hey there. Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly live stream and podcast. I'm Patrick Pfingsten. I write the political newsletter, The Illinoize, which you can find at theillinoise.com. Coming up, we'll be joined by State Senator Robert Martwick. He's a Democrat from the northwest side of Chicago. We'll discuss criminal justice reform and the controversy and political fuss surrounding the end of cash bail in the state. We'll also preview the first debate in the race for governor, which happens Thursday night, tomorrow night. Down in Bloomington. We'll talk about with Pat Brady, former chairman of the Illinois Republican Party. I want to start, though, with the Illinois Supreme Court and how we should be expecting more out of candidates for the highest court in the state. Former state representative, Democratic state representative, now appellate court justice Mary Kay O'Brien released a television ad last week on abortion. It's not a big shock for a Democratic candidate. Let's take a look.
Now that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, in Illinois, extreme groups are trying to take away women's freedom to choose. And this state Supreme Court race will decide who controls our court. Mike Burke says he agreed with the decision to overturn Roe. He's supported by the extreme groups that want to ban all abortion for Illinois women. Justice Mary Kay O'Brien is supported by pro-choice groups and in the past fought to protect a woman's freedom. Illinois has a clear choice. Mary Kay O'Brien, a justice for all.
So the ad claims Burke, who served on the Supreme Court since he was appointed in 2020, says he agreed with the decision to overturn Roe while superimposing supports overturning Roe on the screen. The problem is he never said that. The ad does not come with a citation, so we asked the O'Brien campaign to cite their source. Spokesperson provided a link to a public access TV interview Burke did in July. In the interview, Burke never claims he supports or agrees with the decision to overturn Roe. He does accurately say abortion is not an enumerated right in the U.S. Constitution, but does not offer an opinion whether it should or shouldn't be. And on top of that, the Democratic-controlled All for Fairness PAC is now running an ad that claims Burke wants to ban abortion. Burke has never said that publicly, and he's never ruled on a case involving the issue. So where does it come from? It seems as if it's almost out of thin air. Sadly, we're seeing judicial races, which should be held to higher ethical standards, and they have canons and rules that they have to follow, but they're turning into partisan mudslinging. And that's not new. We've had partisan fights over the courts for years, but more than anything, we're now seeing judicial candidates just make stuff up. That isn't right. And I hope we would expect more out of our judicial candidates and nominees. And this is clearly not going to get any nicer over the last 5 weeks before Election Day. We are pleased to be welcomed by State Senator Rob Martwick, a Democrat from Chicago, who has been very vocal on the criminal justice reform issue and somebody that has a good perspective on it, I think, as a, obviously a Democrat, a progressive, but has a district that has a lot of police officers, first responders that live in it too. So he's kind of getting this from all sides, I'm sure. Senator, I'll ask you the same thing that I asked some of your other colleagues. Considering that many Democrats admit to this point that there need to be changes to the bill before January 1st, did you guys get this right, or was it too rushed? Were there mistakes?
So I smile a little bit because I like to say, as I usually say, which bill is going to get it right? Because I don't, that's what we do is we basically say, here's an idea. But really, realistically speaking, in many instances, you don't know if it's going to work or not for a year, 2 years, 3 years after it's been implemented. That's the nature of change. That's the nature of reform. People talk about reform as like making things better. Reform means change. It doesn't necessarily mean making it better. Don't get me wrong. That's the intent. You're trying to make it better. But sometimes you don't know. And anything as profound as this, the idea that you're going to get it right out of the box is foolish. You've got to really be full of yourself if you think you've got it nailed down and buttoned up tight. And so what I would say is that this was passed and by evidence of the fact that we've combed through it, and before anything has ever been implemented, we have made pretty substantive changes, substantial changes and substantive changes to the law before those provisions have been implemented. And there was a reason that they gave the Pretrial Fairness Act 2 full years before implementation so that they could work through these issues. The bill's sponsors have said from the get-go that they intended to work with stakeholders to fine-tune this to make sure that it could be implemented correctly and properly. So the answer is, the short answer is, did we get it right? I don't think anybody ever gets it right out of the gate, but I think the most important thing is not whether you got it right or wrong when you drafted the bill or even when you passed the bill, but that you're willing to accept the fact that once the application begins, that you have to be prepared to be flexible to make sure that it works so that people are not being harmed and you're doing the most good. And I think if you strip all the political rhetoric out of it, that's what's happening. And I want to say this too, 2 years that the Illinois courts implementation task force has been working on this issue diligently, and this includes Democratic and Republican elected leaders. Senator John Curran, Representative Dan Ugasti sit on this. It is Supreme Court justices, it is the Attorney General, it's pretrial services, state's attorneys, public defenders, sheriffs, chiefs of police. So the stakeholders are at the table doing good work on this, and I think it's reasonable that we would expect that we would take their recommendations and amend the bill to reflect those.
Cash bail is obviously the big talking point right now. The thing that many people are frustrated about, concerned about, et cetera, that the way the law is written, that there are questions about who can be held, how much discretion a judge has, what crimes or what alleged crimes are releasable or not releasable, detainable, et cetera. Scott Bennett's bill that was introduced a couple of weeks ago now would give judges more leeway. It's in saying, yes, you're a threat to the community. You need to be held instead of, and kind of cleans up some of those questions or conflicting statements in the way the law was written originally. Do you support where he's at and what he's proposed so far?
Well, again, I'm a big fan of Scott Bennett, and I appreciate his experience as a criminal prosecutor. I also served in that role. So I appreciate the work that he's done on this. I think that we will take the thoughts of our colleagues, and I think most importantly, we will look at the recommendations of that pretrial task force. I agree with many of the things that he's done, but I think like anything else, the question remains is, and this is where, when we get to Springfield, we'll really sit down and try and justify all of these things from all perspectives, is how do we do our best to make sure that we're getting it as right as possible before we implement. So yeah, there's one thing that I've heard from judges is sort of a lack of discretion. What cash bail gives them is an opportunity to not detain people that they think are a threat to society, but to set the highest level amount of cash bail that they can. So there's a little bit of discretion for them to work to try and keep people detained if they think that they're a threat. There is no discretion. They can only do what the state's attorney. So if the state's attorney decides that someone is not worthy of a detention hearing and the judge feels that they're a danger, the judge can do nothing on their own. And I think judges are concerned about that. And I think it's something that we will look at and try and address. So, yeah.
When it comes to the questions of cash bail, though, it's the argument that many of the supporters of elimination use is that someone who's held on a low-level offense can sit in a county jail for weeks and months on end. But and the governor continues to use that scenario, that potential scenario. But you were in the House in 2017 when the law around cash bail changed, that lowered many of the cash bonds. You see a lot of a lot more recognizance bonds, and even judges today that say, what can you pay? And they get out. And there's that $30 a day credit for those that are held. Is that the same? Is this the same concern that it used to be, considering the changes that you all have already made to cash bail in the state?
I don't know. I think, look, I always choose, Patrick, proactively believe that everyone's intentions start from a good place, even if ultimately we disagree on the best way out of it. What I would say is this: I think that March of 2020, Illinois had been experiencing a decline in crime, and then March of 2020, crime numbers shot through the roof. And again, I can't wait to hear a sociological breakdown on what happened with the lockdown that caused crime to go off the rails. But what I would say is this: it sort of ripped the Band-Aid off and made us take a look at what's going on in public safety. And what I would say is that, and I say this to people all the time, everything that we do in the General Assembly, and you know this, is reform, right? Everything that we're doing, every law that we propose is identifying a problem that we see and attempting to solve that problem and make it better, whether it's drafting errors in previous legislation or new legislation to address a problem. And what I tell people is, if you don't like the way the criminal justice system is working, doubling down on it doesn't seem like a good idea. I agree that there are disagreements on the best path forward, but when it comes to the Pretrial Fairness Act, what I would see, and I did go and sit and watch bond court, and there was so much ambiguity around this dollar value that seemed to have nothing to do with the ultimate questions, which are the foundation of the whole concept of bail, which is, will someone be a threat to society, and will they be a flight risk? And the concept of sort of setting an ambiguous dollar figure without no actual knowledge about whether or not that person meeting that threshold will be no problem or impossible. And so the idea behind the Pretrial Fairness Act was simply to say, let's take that away. Let's put the safety of the victim of crime, because that's really where it stands, even if you don't like it, is the victim of the crime, society at large, and the flight risk as the deciding factors, and take out the ambiguity of money. To me, it seems like a better decision-making process and should end in better results. Of course, what I would say also to that, and I say this all the time, is they say, oh, are you sure it's going to work? And I say, no, it's a human system. And until you can find me a perfect human being, I don't imagine that any system run by human beings will be perfect. But I think it will function better. I'll give you an example. There was a case I watched where a guy was arrested in downtown Chicago at 9 o'clock at night on a Friday. And when he was arrested, he attempted to flee. They caught him. He had 2 loaded semi-automatic weapons and $200,000 of street value of drugs in his vehicle. And he was on parole for a crime of violence. And he received a bond of $200,000, which you would say, wow, that's a really high bond. To which I would say, a guy who just—
But you only have to pay 10%. Yeah.
Well, and a guy just got out of prison and he's got $200,000. Where did he get that from? Logic would say he's part of some organized crime criminal entity, and maybe they'll just bond him out and he'll be back out on the street. And so taking that money out, right? $200,000 is a lot, or is it a little? If he's connected to organized crime, maybe it's nothing. If he's, I would say that it would be hard to imagine he's just some street urchin with $200,000 worth of drugs and 2 pretty expensive weapons in his vehicle, and a vehicle, right? So take that out. Let's focus on public safety. Without a doubt, it's going to be a profound change. There are going to be bumps along the road. The idea is, are we on the right track or the wrong track?
But I don't have to tell you that there are concerns about crime and about the increase in crime, especially in the city. I live in the suburbs. I hear plenty about people who are afraid to even go into the loop or into some neighborhoods at this point. And we've seen a pattern where, and maybe this is just when it comes down to who you elect as a state's attorney, but we're seeing too many, I think a lot of people could agree, too many bad people who aren't being prosecuted, whether it's because they don't have people who are willing to testify, or whether they aren't, whether they don't have a case, or for what other reason. And I'm not in Kim Fox's head for many reasons, but how does this law, in your mind, and if for your constituents who hop on the Edison Park Metro every day and go downtown, how does it make them safer? Because I think they look at this and hear about this and say it's less likely for people who commit crimes, whether they're first offenders, low level, etc., but people who are alleged to commit crimes, we're putting more of them back on the streets and making more threats to us. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would say I don't know that to be the case. The Loyola University did a study on this, and they said that 75% of the people that are currently in the bond system would be eligible for detention under the Pretrial Fairness Act. 75% of them would be eligible to be detained. Under the current system, 75% are not being detained. They're being released on some form of money bond. So potentially, again, I'm not saying that that's how it will actually turn out, but what I'm saying is that right now we have a system where very, very bad people do very, very bad things. And because they have access to money, they can buy organized criminal entities. They can buy their way out of jail and go back and terrorize neighborhoods. And I think that that's wrong. So I think it fundamentally does make it safer if we know that really bad people can't buy their way out. As to low-level offenses, what I would say is that, our country, if you are a patriot and you really believe in our system of democracy, was founded on the principle that innocent until proven guilty, and that you shouldn't languish in jail simply because you don't have access to the same money that someone else did. So it makes our system fairer. I think with the focus on the victim of the crime and the threat to society, I think it has the potential to do things. Again, the devil's in the details in the application. But what I would say is this too: the problem that we're experiencing crime, to tie it all into bail is wrong. We are having a problem with our entire criminal justice system, and we need to really look into it. Let me just say this: City of Chicago, one of the crimes that many people are afraid of, and one of the things we're seeing a big rise of, is carjackings, right? Carjackings. Well, $1 million bond for every carjacker, and hang them, and that'll prevent the crime, right? We will.
I don't think we have the gallows.
No, I know.
But
of course, I
know what you're saying.
I'm being dramatic here. My
of course,
point is that lock them up and throw away the key is not a deterrent if you don't catch anyone. In 2021, the arrest rate, not conviction rate, but the arrest rate on carjackings in the city of Chicago was 4%. 96% of the people that committed carjackings were never even arrested, let alone convicted. So we need to look at how our criminal justice system is working. I'm a big believer in investing to solve problems. I really believe that is our responsibility. So I'm a big believer in, one of the bills that I passed was setting up a multi-jurisdictional task force to treat carjackings as the crime that it's become, and that is an organized criminal entity. I believe in investing in training for our police officers and support and working through these things to make sure that police officers have the tools, the technology, the resources they need to do better at their jobs. 4% arrest rate is not enough. So there's so many things about our criminal justice system that's not working and that have changed. And so to hone in on one, and I get it, it's political, and I get why we do it. And I think it's fair. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be concerned about it. As much as I'm a supporter of it, I agree. 100 of 102 states attorneys saying we should really look at this thing means we ought to really look at this thing. I'm happy to say that's what we're doing. But I think we need to look at, especially in the city of Chicago, not just investing in police officers, but a rise of crime means a rise of criminals. I think we need to invest in these disadvantaged communities and make sure that kids have quality alternatives, wraparound programs, summer jobs programs, after school violence interruptions program, mental health, addiction counseling, to make sure that we're giving them opportunities to succeed. And I'm happy to say that Illinois is on that path. Those things are going to take a lot longer. They will not solve crime overnight. But I think that's the wholesale issue that we need to work on.
And before we let you go, Senator, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today and appreciate the time is the fact that your district, which is kind of the northwest side of Chicago, some of the northwest suburbs, you actually have my neighborhood in just across the city limits in the suburbs, and you have the northwest side is famous for having a lot of police officers who live there. And firefighters as well, first responders. We've heard from police up and down the state, around the state, their leaders, their chiefs, sheriffs, etc., that feel as if the legislature, politicians, this law in general, and maybe you just say Democrats in general, don't have their backs. That you all are more concerned about criminals than the people who are putting their lives at risk to protect and serve. How and I'm sure that you've heard some of that in the neighborhoods that you represent. So I guess, one, what are you hearing from the police, from the people you represent, and two, how do you respond to that?
I would say that there is a lot of that sentiment, but I would say that that's driven largely by sort of this ideology that has crept into the culture of policing. You look at the FOP president that we currently have right now in the city of Chicago, and he has sort of created this idea that it's Democrats versus Republicans when it comes to policing. That, of course, flies in the face of the facts. I would tell you, Patrick, and I would say this quite confidently, that there is not a single legislator over the course of the last 10 years that has done more to improve the economic benefits, the workplace safeties, and the retirement security of police officers than the person you're talking to right now. That's me. Additionally, when we went into these negotiations over the Safety Act, two of the things I fought for was ensuring that police officers kept their collective bargaining rights, which was easy for me. I'd spent 4 years battling Governor Rauner on that issue. I certainly wasn't going to give in to Democrats' attempts to diminish it. But additionally, most importantly, kept their protection from immunity from lawsuits, right? So they couldn't lose their personal belongings and their wealth and what they've accumulated in their life on a lawsuit against a police officer. So it's not Democrat versus Republican. And again, it's sort of become a culture war that, as I said, police officers are public sector employees that we give our greatest confidence to. We give them the ability to take our freedom and to take our lives. And we give them the authority to do that, a badge and a gun. And with that comes an enormous responsibility. And what I would say is that when a large portion of your population, federal consent decrees, police officers sent to jail for torture and abuse, Watts, there are all sorts of problems going on. I think police officers should embrace reform, police reform. And I think that you can accomplish both better policing, better relationships with your communities, and still support the things that make police officers' job something that they still want to do, and that they have, something that they can do with pride and retire with dignity when they're done. That's the approach I've always taken. No doubt about it. When I meet someone who is ideologically decided that because I'm a Democrat, I hate police officers, well, I'm not going to convince them of that. In fact, I'll say those things, and I'll even hear things like, yeah, I know you helped our pension, but still, I know you protected our collective bargaining, but still, well, you're not going to make any progress with them. But those who are not ideologically drawn to one side or the other, they understand that and they respect that. And if I may be so bold, I think my last election results against the Chicago police officer indicated that I wouldn't have gotten to 67% without some police officers going, yeah, I think this guy's going to do a better job of having our backs than a police officer is.
Senator Rob Martwick, thanks so much for the time. I know there's there's plenty more going on, and we could probably talk for days on pensions and guns and those sort of things. But alas, we have things to do. So hopefully we'll have you back soon, and we can talk soon. And I'm sure we'll see you down for veto session in November.
I look forward to it. Thanks for having me on, Patrick. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Senator. All right, that's Senator Robert Martwick joining us this afternoon. Appreciate his time and his discussion on cash bail and on the Safety Act and some of those issues. But let's move on now to politics. So Governor J.B. Pritzker and his Republican opponent, Darren Bailey, the state senator, have their first televised debate tomorrow, Thursday. And we wanted to talk about it a little bit, preview it, what to expect. Can Darren Bailey make a race of this? All independent polls show him at least 15 points down. So we thought we'd bring in an expert. Our friend Pat Brady, who's the former Illinois Republican Party chairman, did not support Brady in the primary, worked for another candidate, just to be clear on that. Pat, let me just start big picture. What can Darren Bailey do in a televised debate 5 weeks out from the election to make a race of this?
I think primarily he's got to convince the voters that he's up to the task of being governor. In these presidential debates, remember, you always talk about being presidential, but he needs to look like a governor. And in this case, it probably means that he's up for the task, that he understands the entire state, not just the southern part of the state. And he needs to, first of all, do that. And then secondly, which I think he's not done yet, is to sketch out exactly what he would do as governor different and or better than what J.B. Pritzker is doing. I think and we've seen how this has shaken out with Republicans. They want to talk about the economy and inflation, and the Democrats want to talk about abortion and Trump. And I think he's going to have to somehow try to nationalize this and tie Joe Biden, some of the far left policies that the Democrats have supported, and say that J.B. Pritzker is a junior Joe Biden. I watched the Texas debate, governor debate the other night, and that's pretty much what Governor Abbott tried to do to Beto O'Rourke, his challenger, was nationalize it and make it about Biden. So those are the things that he needs to try to do, I think. Whether or not he can do them, I don't know. He does have an uphill climb. I just lost you, Patrick.
Sorry, the two men did a virtual sit down last week with newspaper editors. We kind of got a preview of their messaging with, and you saw in that instance, you could see the difference in preparation. J.B. Pritzker was very prepared, very polished, very put together, clearly had been doing his homework, and Darren Bailey was very freewheeling. Not a lot of facts, not a lot of substance. Is what I guess the question is, what do you expect to see out of these two, and do you think Darren Bailey can make himself look more polished, and could he even be more polished at this point?
I'm sure he could be. Anybody can be. We can all be. I can be. You can be. But that was kind of my takeaway too from that session, that he didn't seem overly prepared or didn't have an overarching message that seemed to resonate. And listen, when J.B. Pritzker, I think his first public appearance when he announced he was running for governor was on WGN radio, and I listened to it. It was a little Rick Pearson show. And I called up some people on the Republican side. I go, don't underestimate this guy. He's a very polished speaker. He's a smart guy. He's prepared. He takes it seriously. And now he's got presidential aspirations. So every time he appears, he knows that particular appearance might show up somewhere in a presidential commercial. So he prepares. But for the life of me, why anybody at this level that's seeking this high of an office isn't overly prepared for any and all appearances is beyond me. And it, like I said, I took away the same impression. I don't know how you could not be prepared. That being said, do people focus on ed board meetings and some of these debates? Maybe not. There's not a lot of persuadable voters left. But again, if he's going to stop the bleeding here, he needs to convince people that he's up for the task of being governor.
You know, that's, I think, a very important part of this is how he also needs to lay some punches on the governor too. and clear. We know that Pritzker's going to make this. Darren Bailey's a radical. Darren Bailey is opposed to abortion. Darren Bailey is Trump 2.0. If you're advising Bailey, how do you hit Pritzker and make it stick with undecided voters?
I'm not sure exactly, and I'm somewhat confused. I think a lot of people are, exactly what issues voters are focusing on and what voters are going to turn out. I'm getting anecdotally, and up here I'm in the Chicago area, that the Safety Act and the attacks that Jim Durkin and the House Republicans and others have been making on that particular piece of legislation have been very effective. So he probably needs to, Darren Bailey needs to statewide-ize, for lack of a better word, the crime problem and try to put that crime problem on the back of J.B. Pritzker. Now, I'm not sure if the governor necessarily wears the jacket for crime problems in the city of Chicago and the suburbs, but the Safety Act, I think a lot of people, whether you agree or disagree with some of the information that's out there, and some of it's just not right on the Safety Act, even Democrats think that law is problematic, and that could be a problem for the governor if the focus is on crime. And so I think that's probably one of the punches he can take. I used to think up until a couple of months ago that maybe you could attack him on some of the COVID response and shutting the businesses down, but it appears that we're beyond that. But I think crime for Darren Bailey probably the big issue that he could punch the governor on and probably have some success.
I wrote about this Tuesday in the newsletter that there are roughly 3.5 million homes with the TV in the Chicago market. WGN's 6 o'clock news gets a 1.4 rating. So that's roughly 49,000 people in Chicago watching that newscast. It's going to be lower than that for a 7 o'clock time slot, but relatively speaking, 8.4% undecided in the WGN poll last week. So that means you're roughly looking at 4,100 undecided voters that are watching this debate in Chicago. There would be more downstate, obviously, but is there really even much to win or lose here because there are so few undecideds left in this race?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I know what those numbers are with WGN and others, but the reality is if either of these candidates can score a really defining blow or make a really good point in these debates, the multiplier of that on social media is probably 10, if not more times fold the number of people that are going to see it. It might even show up in a commercial. So I agree that I don't think people tune into debates. They tend to tune into the first one more than the others. But I agree with the numbers you've cited. There are not a lot of persuadables, and not a lot of those are going to be watching this debate. But again, the debates are an opportunity to maybe get that gotcha or aha moment that you can spread out on social media and commercials and other ways.
What's the best scenario for Republicans today? Because if we look at the odds, if we look at the fact that it's October 5th and Darren Bailey still hasn't run a TV ad, I mean, the chances are he's not going to win this race. But if he's losing by 15 or 20 points, he theoretically pulls down Republicans down the ballot, congressional races, statewide races, legislative races. So if you're a concerned Republican who has a tight legislative race or a congressional race you care about, are you just hoping that Bailey can make a respectable show of this over the last month?
Yeah, I think that's been the hope all along. But the reality is, Patrick, and I've said this publicly for a year, that dumbass Mike Zonarovich and the people that decided that they were going to, in secret, put Richard Irvin up as our nominee. And I like Richard Irvin, but the way that they handled this and resulting in Ken Griffin pulling out all his money, the net effect of that complete incompetence and arrogance has put the Republican Party in such a horrible position in funding and in messaging that it makes it. I agree with what you're saying that Darren Bailey needs to perform to a certain level. Trump got 41.5%. If he does that well, I think that'll help down ticket. But the reality is we are in this horrible position because Mike Zonarovich, the consultant that came in and thought he knew everything, decided to run this guy that the Republican Party didn't support. And when it didn't work out, all the money dried up. So we're in this spot because of some very arrogant and stupid people. And we're trying to do the best we can. And we can't pin it all on what Darren Bailey does or doesn't do. Had Mike Zonarovich not done this, there would have been money for House and Senate Republicans, for the other constitutional officer races like my cousin Dan Brady, who's running for Secretary of State. if he had $5 million in his pocket right now, he'd stomp all over Alexa Giannoulis. He's very popular in the state. So people are pinning it all on Darren Bailey. I'm not pinning it on Darren Bailey. He won 57% of the vote. I'm pinning it on Mike Zonarovich, who came in here and absolutely destroyed the Republican Party in Illinois and moved back to Tennessee. So I think that's people want to blame Bailey. And believe me, there have been some problems with his campaign that he's well aware of. But the source of all this problem is a dumbass Mike Z who just decided he was going to take over the state and just absolutely destroyed it.
Pat, before we let you go, what's a win in this debate for Governor Pritzker, and what's a win in this debate for Darren Bailey?
A win in this debate for Darren Bailey is if he can stand up and people can look at him and go, this guy could be governor. I think a win for Governor Pritzker is just get out, not make a huge gaffe, keep a smile on your face, kind of pull a Reagan with Darren Bailey, say, there you go again, and try to continue to portray Darren Bailey as a, part of Trumpism, out of touch, too extreme. I suspect that the governor will probably just keep a smile on his face, take the punches and move on. I think he just wants to get these debates over with and move on to the election.
Pat Brady, former Illinois Republican Party chairman, strategist as well. Pat, thanks so much for the time.
Patrick, always. We'll take care. See ya.
Good. All right. Thanks to our friend Pat Brady for joining us this afternoon on our live stream and podcast, talking about the gubernatorial debate that's next to our stations around the state Thursday at 7. So that's WGN in Chicago, WCIA in Champaign, Decatur, Springfield, WMBD in Peoria. So you can check that out tomorrow night and let us know your thoughts. Drop us an email, send us a note, send us a message on Facebook. We're interested in hearing your thoughts on what you see out of that debate as well. Thanks so much for taking time with us this Wednesday, and hope to have some more for you next week as we continue rushing toward the November 8th general election. It's getting crazy. The ads are getting fired up, and people are getting testy, as they tend to do a month out before the election. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time on the Illinoize.